We're Haley and Cooper, and we've spent the past 2 months living full-time in our renovated RV. We spent most of June going through Badlands National Park and Custer State Park in South Dakota, and just spent all of July in Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks. We have explored these parks through hiking, sightseeing, and wildlife photography. Follow along to see where we go next in our RV journey across America.
On Sunday, we woke up in America's oldest national park, which is
Yellowstone!
This week is a little different than the other weeks we have been doing because we had family coming in to visit us for the first time in our RV journey.
My mom and stepdad have been joining us for this past week, which has been excellent. So we've had a lot more company in all of our excursions and adventures, and we'll get to tell you more about that.
We started off going out for breakfast at Euro Cafe.
It was actually this hole-in-the-wall place, and it was excellent. We really enjoyed going there, so maybe we'll get to go back.
Then after breakfast, we went to church in town, which is a cool little mountain church. Apparently the priest was saying that they don't really have a community there. Everyone who goes to church is just tourists coming in, which is kind of cool.
They had everyone raise their hands who was a tourist, and it was basically the whole community.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then after that, we went to show her parents our RV for the first time, which is the first people that have been in our RV since we left, so it's kind of exciting.
Yeah, got to show him more about how we actually use the space versus before when we were with his family, it was more like, this is how we think we'll live in this, and this is how we think this will go, so this felt a little more personal, and it was fun to get to show them our home.
And then we went into the park for the first time to the Grant Village Visitor Center.
There's a lot of visitor centers in the park. We were a little confused what was the main one. And so someone had told us to go to this one first and we're like, it must be the biggest. And it's this tiny little visitor center. And it took us an hour and a half to get there. It was nice, don't get me wrong, but it was not the biggest one in the park by far. Each of the visitor centers has a different theme to it, and they're kind of focusing on some other particular aspect of the park. So that particular visitor center focuses on the fire that happened back in the 1980s. Cooper spent a lot of time walking around and learning all about that, while we got situated and figured out kind of where we are in the park and where there are the main attractions, what to do, how long it takes to get there, things like that. So one of the main things about Yellowstone that you may not know if you haven't been is it is enormous. Actual states will fit inside of Yellowstone. It's so big, and it takes a long time to drive around. So the scenery is beautiful and we loved everything we got to see, but you have to plan that it's going to take you about an hour and a half to get almost anywhere within the park.
And that's just to get out, and then also as to come back. So there's 2 loops in Yellowstone. There's the upper and the lower loops. You can do the grand loop, which is just the outside of both of them. And the lower loop to get from visitor center to visitor center or to junction to junction is about half an hour between. And while you think you could do this faster, you're not
can't.
You're not the limiting factor in the speed. Everyone else who is driving bigger vehicles or tours or things like that only go max the speed limit, which is 45. So it really does take you half an hour to get to place. And on the northern loop, it takes you 45 minutes to go from junction to junction. It's a little less popular, but there is still plenty of vehicles and traffic that's just gonna slow you down,
And that's with no animal stops. So if there's elk on the side of the road, definitely if there's bear, or even if there's just bison actively crossing the road, everybody's gonna have to back up and wait until either that animal finishes crossing or until that animal goes out of sight. And you have less tourists and stuff on the road trying to see whatever it was that was around the corner. So definitely planning in the driving was big. So we hiked way too far into Yellowstone as far as driving goes to get to this very cute but very small visitor center. Went to one of the grills that was kind of attached to their main area after that, and that was delicious. Had some huckleberry soda, which is kind of one of the things of the area. It's huckleberry flavored things. So we did that and continued on our journey and started to actually really explore the park itself.
Yeah, and from that visitor center, we then went to Old Faithful. I believe was our first major stop we were going to. Stopped at a couple of viewpoints on the way, which is very cool. But her stepdad has not been to Old Faithful yet, so it was kind of a big deal. He's like, I really want to see Old Faithful, and we timed it perfectly. Now there is a number you can call that will tell you the estimated time of eruptions for all the main geysers. However, in Yellowstone, there's not a ton of service. So
That's true. Almost nowhere.
We couldn't really call them and get an estimate, so we just kind of showed up, and it was erupting, I think, within a half hour of us showing up. And we also went late at night. I think we got there around 7:30, which is the ideal time to see Old Faithful because it's still bright out, it's not very hot, and there's not really a ton of people there.
All things considering, if you see our photos and stuff, there's still people everywhere and all the benches around Old Faithful are still full. But if you see photos from people who go there in the peak of the day, one, like you said, it's gonna be blazing hot. and 2, it is packed. Like, it is packed all the time. The parking lot is absolutely enormous because they're trying to compensate for all the tourists who only are going to be there for a day, and this is all they have time to do. So we were really lucky that we got to go so late and be able to see everything there as well. One of the quick things we wanted to mention, if you're looking for kind of smaller side attractions on your way to or from Old Faithful, one of the things we loved doing from Grant Village to Old Faithful was stopping at Isa Lake. Isa Lake is really unique. It's actually the only natural lake in the world that has this particular feature.
The lake's unique feature is that it drains into both the Atlantic and the Pacific Ocean, so it is the only natural lake in the world, like Haley said, that drains into 2 different oceans. So apparently there are a couple man-made ones. The sign didn't really tell us. Yeah, but it basically is on the continental divide or right next to it, and it kind of swirls around in 2 directions and then empties out into both oceans, which is cool. It's not a big lake. It's like more of like a pond.
It's pretty tiny, but it has this fun geological fact about it. So we definitely think it was worth a stop just because it's literally unique in the span of the world. After that, we went to Kepler Cascades, which again is also on our way to Old Faithful if you're coming in from the east side. And we actually loved that waterfall. There's a lot of waterfalls in Yellowstone, and we'll talk more about them over the course of this video and probably also next week as well. But as far as the smaller waterfalls, this was our favorite. It's a beautiful 50-foot waterfall. It's like, doesn't really have a ton of parking, but there really wasn't anybody there. And I think they're really missing out because it was gorgeous.
Most of the waterfalls have like a bigger parking lot or a pull-off that you can go to, and there's a big sign. This one didn't really. It did have a really small parking lot for like 10 cars or so, but everyone who was there along with us were amazed at how cool the waterfall is. I don't know if it was just more powerful because of rain or something in the past, but everyone was saying this is like their favorite waterfall that they have seen because it was, and in our opinion, it was the best waterfall you see other than the main ones, which we'll get to in a different video. Yeah,
there's some really big ones in Yellowstone, so excluding those 2 large ones, which we'll talk about in the future, of the quote, again, smaller waterfalls, definitely stop by Kepler Cascades.
Then on Monday, we decided to book a wildlife tour with Tied to Nature Wildlife Tours.
Which was great. They're based out of Island Park, Idaho, which is where my family was staying. So that's kind of on the west side of Yellowstone itself. And we really enjoyed our experience with them. We stayed the night at my mom and stepdad's Airbnb the night before, just so we would be a little bit closer whenever they came to pick us up, which was at 5 in the morning. And we began our journey. The reason it's so early is because the best viewing times for animals is whenever it's the coolest in the day. So think early in the morning or late in the evening. And so we woke up early and headed out with our guide, Adam, to go check out some wolves and bears and things like that.
And it was really good to have a wildlife tour guide because, like we said, Yellowstone is so big, it's hard to know where the wildlife is. You can't just drive down the road and be like, oh, look, there's a jam, because if people are stopping for elk, some people stop for like squirrels or like really unique animals that you wouldn't stop for. So you can't just tell where the animals are like you could in Grand Teton National Park. So we get out and there is this group of people all stopped and they all have their scopes for viewing wildlife, which is really, really helpful. I don't think it's necessary to purchase one to go to Yellowstone.
They're about like $2 or $3 grand. So it was helpful just to go on this tour and be with someone who already knew what they were doing and already had one.
Yeah, and then also, I mean, the wolves were a mile and a half away. You couldn't really see them. You could maybe see them with just your eyes. They just were like black
with binoculars, specks. It was a little easier, but the scope made a huge difference.
Yeah, and so the scope, we were able to get a couple of videos of it off of his phone, which was very cool. So then after looking at that for about a half hour or so, we kept going to go find grizzly bears.
And we were successful. So we were continuing along our way, and then we turned at this area called Fishing Bridge and continued toward the east entrance. And down that path, there's a lot of known grizzly bears who live pretty close to the road. We learned, fun fact, that a lot of the male grizzly bears will actually kill the cubs, which is not a very fun fact, I suppose. So the mothers have taken to living right by the roadside because it actually keeps them safe. The males like to live farther away from the road. So that was really neat because then you get to see moms with cubs and stuff. So we got to see a rather young bear. She is about 4, I think they said, and she's been kind of colloquially named Jam. So she was really fun. We got to see her pretty close. You could actually see her with the naked eye, and then obviously really, really easily through the scope and through binoculars. Yeah. It was fun just to see her kind of interact with her environment and roll over the logs and jump around, and she was just fun to watch.
After viewing the bears, we kind of just kept driving around. Adam was looking for more wildlife that was more than just the bison and elk because they're a little harder to find.
Bison and elk are the easy parts to find. The wolves and the bears, you're kind of hit or miss as far as what you will or won't see. We looked for mountain goat too, but we're unsuccessful that day.
We kept going until we hit Tower Falls, which is another waterfall. and in our opinion wasn't as good as Kepler Cascades. There's more people, you're kind of farther away, wasn't as good of a viewing, but still good to stop
Still nice,
at.
yeah.
There's a little visitor center and everything there if you're looking for like a small snack or ice cream. I know what they have there. And then we stopped to get a picnic on the way home, and also at Chocolate Pot for a quick viewing, and then we just ended up going home after that.
One of the things to mention about the picnic area is that there's picnic areas all throughout the park, and they're all in really lovely spots. So there's not a lot of places to eat within the park, and if there are ones that you come across, they tend to be a little more expensive. So something to mention is if you're doing this on a budget, bring sandwiches, find a great spot by one of the riversides, and just enjoy your time there as well. So after we went to the Chocolate Pot, we went ahead and just ended our tour, drove back to where we were staying, took a really long nap because we've been up quite early, and then that evening we went still in Island Park to Pond's Lodge, which was a really excellent pizza spot. It was clearly where all the locals go, and we really enjoyed it. We're not like big, I mean, we like pizza just like everybody likes pizza, but normally you just go to a pizza place and you're like, it was fine. And that was actually very good.
It was very good pizza. Definitely recommend going there if you have the time. It is not near Yellowstone. It's like a half hour away from Yellowstone, but if you're staying outside of Yellowstone towards it, definitely go there for pizza. They've got sports and everything up on the TVs. It's kind of more like a sports bar, but they sell really good pizza.
And I'm actually gluten-free, so quick plug for the gluten-free people is that they had that there. And they had gluten-free mozzarella sticks, which I haven't had in ages. On Tuesday, we worked most of the day, but then we met up with my parents again, and we started to hike Fairy Falls. So if you're not familiar with that, one of the things you might be familiar with is the Grand Prismatic Basin. It's basically the #1 or the #2 top thing to do in Yellowstone. It kind of battles with Old Faithful for that honor. And it is this enormous hot spring basin that has all these beautiful colors in it, and all the colors are created by these microbes that live in different temperatures. So because this one's so big, it has so many colors because it has so much different temperature gradient. But whenever you like walk right around it, you can't actually really see the colors that well. You're just too close and there's too much steam building off it. So kind of a lesser known point is to go to the Fairy Falls hike, and you don't actually have to walk the full distance. You walk about, I think it's a mile out and a mile back.
So you get all the way out to Fairy Falls. I think it's a total of 3 miles out, 3 miles back, but just get to the viewpoint, I think it's mile, maybe a mile and a half.
And you kind of have hiked up this cliff and you're overlooking it, so you can really get this spectacular view of the basin itself and really see the full depth of color.
Yeah, and just a quick note for this and everything else we're doing in Yellowstone, we're doing it after our workday, which saved us a ton of time in driving with traffic and also a ton of stress when you get there, because you're viewing all these things after everyone has left and is going to dinner. So with Old Faithful, the previous couple of days and the wildlife viewings, we didn't have a ton of issues with other people being in our way. And same with this viewpoint, it's not very big.
Right.
And there was maybe 20 people other than us up there, and it was pretty busy with just the 20 people.
But we still felt we had enough space to actually view the basin, really get to take pictures and enjoy it. If you were there in the peak of the day, like I was saying earlier with Old Faithful, it would have been absolutely packed. Like I said, it is lesser known, but it's known enough that it still gets really busy.
We then decided to keep going and go see Old Faithful again, but on the way stop at Biscuit Basin, because earlier in that day there's actually a hydrothermal explosion, which I made a whole video about it, which I'll link here, that blew up the whole basin, and we're gonna go see ourselves what was the aftermath.
So you can't actually get up to it, or at least you couldn't whenever we were visiting. I think they have it closed for the whole season because there's an enormous crater where this thing went off and it blew up the boardwalk, and I'm sure you all have seen the videos, or you'll get to see them in the video Cooper already posted. But you can only really see it from the road, so we're like peeking over the guardrails to take a look at it. But we drove by that and then we continued onward. We again had already been to Old Faithful, but there's so many geysers in the area that we also wanted to see.
So we actually ended up parking at the Old Faithful Inn this time, which is a kind of a historical building. It's a log style wooden building, which is the tallest in the world actually. I think it's over 70 feet tall.
It's a 76-foot building, and it's the largest log cabin structure in the world. And it's built in 1904. It's actually huge, and you don't need to be staying in Old Faithful Inn to be able to go into the building. There's a lot of shops in there. There's a few restaurants, things like that. And it's just really spectacular. It's very, very cool looking. You can actually also, we didn't do this, but you can hike the stairs all the way up to the top and get a great view of Old Faithful from there as well.
Yes, it was a really awesome, definitely recommend going in there. There are a couple of restaurants in there that you can go to as well. We ended up going to the Bear Pit Lodge, or Lounge, or however you say it. It was okay. It was a little overpriced for what the food was. It mainly looked like it was for drinks and appetizers. They also had a burger that we got, which
it was fine.
It was a burger. It wasn't anything special, so don't need to eat there, but it is available if you need it.
And one of the things that was nice is the other dining area that's in that particular space fills up really fast as far as reservations go. So this was a good option for just a walk-in. Afterwards, we walked around and saw Old Faithful again because we're there, you might as well, and it was going off pretty soon. And behind Old Faithful, there's kind of a slightly lesser known area, which is called Geyser Hill. And there's a bunch of geysers back there. This whole area in general, actually, it's all part of the upper Geyser Basin. And this 2 square mile section has the most concentrated amount of geysers and hot springs in the world. They have over 200 geysers just in these 2 square miles. And we got to walk around and see a couple of them go off in the distance and just kind of enjoy the view as the sun was going down. So it was really beautiful.
Yeah, it was a really cool time. Same thing, it was late at night, so there was no one on the paths. So we
Right.
had all to ourselves, which is really awesome. And there's no shade either. So if you go at night, it doesn't get as hot. And you're by hot springs, which also produce heat. So I could imagine being very hot in the day. And then also a quick fun fact about Yellowstone. Haley kind of touched on it. This geyser basin in Yellowstone contains over a quarter of the geysers in the world. And Yellowstone in general has over half of the geysers in the world. So it really is just a place that is unlike anywhere else in the world.
Yeah.
So it's a very cool national park to go to.
Absolutely. It's worth the hype.
On Wednesday, we decided to make a even longer journey out through Yellowstone, out to Mammoth Hot Springs, which was about 2.5 hours away from where we're staying. But on the way out there, we decided to stop at a couple of the main outlooks.
So we don't want to cover all those because we stopped at so many, but our favorite was definitely Artist Paint Pots. This is kind of a relatively well-known trail on the west side of Yellowstone, and you kind of hike about a mile out, and then there's all of these areas that have these various very, very vibrant thermal hot springs, but much smaller than the Grand Prismatic Basin. But each one is kind of a different color. So there's ones that are red, green, orange. There was supposed to be one that was lavender, but we couldn't find it. And there's blue ones as well. So again, those are all based off of the temperature of the spring. It's growing these different microorganisms that are giving the spring that particular color. So that was pretty cool. I think Cooper thought it was a little bit overhyped. But it was still pretty neat.
In my opinion, it just looked like some of the other geysers we'd already seen, so it wasn't as exciting.
It's still cool though.
But it was still
that
cool.
It exists.
And then we also, on the way, stopped at Swan Lake, where there actually was this breed of swans. I can never remember the name. I don't know if Haley
Trumpeter
can.
swans.
Which are apparently like pretty rare swans in the term of swans. I don't know anything about swans. And we were able to see them at Swan Lake. So it was kind of cool that the lake was actually named after what you could find there.
Right. So that was on our way to Mammoth Hot Springs, and then we arrive at this particular location, which again is one of the other major attractions in the park. So if you kind of Google Yellowstone, you'll hear a number of the things that we're mentioning now. And this again is another area that gets really crowded. So we were also there in the evening, which worked out pretty well with our work schedule. So this is a huge section of park, and they're all based off of these travertine terraces that have grown over time with the hot springs underneath.
And a really cool fact about this is these springs grow really, really fast and also just kind of shut off and appear out of nowhere. To the point where they say that if you come a year later, it could look completely different because springs could just pop up or disappear. And it's happened. They have some springs that have been going on for decades and are huge, and then other ones that have just started that are like little craters in the ground. But they say in a couple of years it could be something big or it could just stop.
Yeah, so we actually got to see this in action in the sense of there was a couple sections where they had photos of what that particular area used to look like in Mammoth and now what it looks like now. There was no water coming out, so the color of the rock had actually changed based off the fact there was less minerals coming into that particular area. So it was neat.
Honestly, Mammoth Hot Springs was probably one of my favorite areas to go to because it was the most unique thing. It was like the geysers were really, really awesome, but there's so many geysers that they all kind of start to blur together, like looking back at them. I can't remember which ones were where, but Mammoth Hot Springs was the only place where these things were growing and stopping like daily.
And it's a huge area.
It's a huge area. Like you can drive around it for a half hour or so.
Yeah.
And there's like big walking paths that go through it. And it's just like, it's like on a mountain almost, like sloping down. It's just really unique. The park didn't have anything else like that size.
No, that's true.
Of this geyser pool.
Yeah, so we enjoyed that. Definitely recommend. There's a reason why, again, it's on the top list of all the things you should do. After our very long journey back into West Yellowstone, which was the area we were staying, we went to another pizza place and also just really exceptionally good. This was Pete's Rocky Mountain Pizza. We were there, as always, quite late, so we didn't have to wait much in line, but again, a really great pizza place and another great gluten-free place as well if you're looking for it.
A good thing to note about West Yellowstone, which is where we were staying, everything's open until like 10 o'clock
so
at
late.
night.
They stay open
Don't know
so
why.
late.
Like all the t-shirt shops, ice cream, everything is open until 10 o'clock, which is great because if you're in the park till late at night, you can still come through and get dinner or get a snack or something like that.
We just don't really know who's buying a t-shirt at like 9:45 at night, but apparently you can if you want
If you really
one.
want to.
On Thursday, my mom and Brian decided they were gonna head over to the Grand Tetons and see all of that, and we've obviously gotten to see all that. Hopefully you've seen our previous weeks of videos, but Cooper can link them below if you haven't. So anyway, so we were going to go on a bit more of an adventurous walk and headed back to the Old Faithful area, surprise, surprise, to go see more of the Upper Geyser Basin. It is huge, like I said earlier, it's 2 square miles and there's so much to see. So there was more areas we hadn't gotten to take a look at yet.
Yeah, and it's really cool. And all of these geysers are documented when they erupt. And Haley, being the nerd that she is, wanted to look up every single geyser and when it last erupted, which is really interesting for the first 3. But by the time we get to the 100th geyser, I was over it and wanted to keep going.
I wanted to know. So whenever he says erupt, by the way, he doesn't mean when they're going to erupt. Like he mentioned before, there's only about 5 or 6 that they have timed well enough to know when they're going to erupt next. But if you go to this random website called Geyser Times, it'll tell you when the last eruption was of that particular geyser. So I thought it was interesting.
So you'd be like, wow, this geyser erupted 7 years ago. And I was like, okay.
I didn't care that he didn't think it was interesting. I thought it was fascinating. So he got to hear about all of them.
Mm-hmm.
So we walked around there for a while, which was great. There are, in fact, a lot of geysers, like we mentioned before. And we got to see a couple of them go off, ones that aren't timed. So that was neat because you just have to stumble upon it. It's kind of like seeing the animals in the sense that you don't know if you're going to succeed. You drive around and you're not sure if you'll see any, and then you're lucky if you do. And so geysers are a lot like that as well. You just kind of have to walk up and hope that they're going off or that any will go off soon. So we got to see one called the Grotto Geyser, which we really enjoyed.
Yeah, and this geyser is really unique because it has like an arch in the geyser section, whatever you want to call it. And no one knows what this arch is really made out of in front of the geyser because no one wants to go in and cut it open because they're going to ruin it forever. But they think what happened is the geyser basically started up between a bunch of trees, and one of the trees died and kind of like fell over and then was covered by all the minerals before it decayed and created this like archway made out of geyser.
Most of the geysers are either shaped like a cone, they're called cone geysers, like Old Faithful, or they're this large pool that just happens to like randomly erupt, and those are called fountain geysers. So this one is quite different. Technically it's a fountain geyser, but it's a really, really unique shape like he mentioned, and we just happened to get to see it go off, which was super fun. So that one goes off, I think, for hours. So we sat there and watched it for about 15 minutes and then continued on down the path to the Morning Glory Pool, which is a big tourist attraction, but
it was a little bit of a letdown because people have thrown rocks and garbage and just leaves have fallen into it where the temperature has actually changed. And because the temperature has changed, the colors have changed. So if you see a blue geyser, like pure blue, which we have seen, it means it's the hottest temperature that the water can pretty much get. And then it kind of goes down from there. Orange is like the coolest or the coldest. It's still warm, but so the edges are starting to turn like green, yellow, starting to cool off, and the water's not as clear, which does suck. One, because it's like a 2-mile hike to get out there. We were like, this is it. Like it was kind of underwhelming compared to what we were seeing.
right.
And it's just a bummer that Yellowstone is changing like this. And part of it is due to tourism and people just being dumb. And also part of it is due to nature. So kind of like the Mammoth Hot Springs, the rest of the park doesn't change as fast as Mammoth Hot Springs does, but it is still constantly changing.
So that's just something to point out, is that don't throw anything into the geysers or the hot springs or anything else because you're ruining it for the people after you, because like we said, this is supposed to be a brilliantly blue pool and now it's this kind of murky green and orange, which was still cool, don't get me wrong. It's not something you see every day, but it wasn't the hype that it was supposed to have because people have been damaging it over the years.
The next day on Friday, we were all pretty tired from the past week of
Lots
just
of
doing
things.
things constantly. So we just kind of had a night in, grilled some burgers, watched the Olympic opening ceremony, and that was pretty much the entire day. On Saturday morning, we actually were moving campgrounds, but we wanted to go see the park throughout the whole day on Saturday because we weren't working. So we left our first campground, which was
Baker's Hole. And we actually really loved that spot. It was really close to West Yellowstone itself. It was really shaded. There was a decent amount of people there, but it wasn't super crowded. And it had electric hookups as well, which is nice. So it was a great price point for that spot.
And the pit toilets were very clean. Only downside, it was a little close to the road, so you could hear like traffic going by, but I mean, that's a pretty small complaint for everything else it offered.
So we were moving from that particular campsite to Rainbow Point later in the day. In the meantime, we parked our RV in the visitor center downtown so we could go explore the rest of the park.
We decided to go to the park to Lamar Valley, which is again like 2 hours of driving away. So we had to leave early in the morning so we could get there in time in the hopes of seeing bison. And we saw more bison
than you can imagine.
than you could ever want to see in your life. I mean, it was thousands of bison, like right on the road or next to the road or crossing the road, just everywhere.
And they're currently in their rut, which is basically the breeding season of these bison. It lasts, I think, for a couple of months. So all of the big males who are normally loners off by themselves were in and among these herds of female and young baby bison. So it was really neat. They're really loud. The males are very vocal. So we got to hear them kind of grunting and basically flirting with all the female bison and trying to sequester whichever ones were going to be their girls.
I'm not sure if this would work for people, but apparently what the male bison do is they kind of like corner the female bison away from everyone else. And just
I don't think it would work for people.
And just kind of like keep them set off as like, hey, these are my
And then they fight each other whenever any other males try and come in and take their women. So we got to do that. If you ever are looking for animals, you probably hear mostly about Hayden Valley, which is where we went with the wildlife tour, and Lamar Valley. Those are the two major animal sighting locations as far as that. So we hadn't gotten to explore Lamar yet, and we got to do so today. Lots of bison, like you mentioned. We looked for bear, but we didn't end up seeing any. We did, however, get to see some more wolves. We drove over to this section called Slough Creek, and we only really knew about it because we were talking to other tourists who were looking at animals in the area. So definitely recommend talking to people around you whenever you're stopping to check something out, because they might know of something just down the road or right around the corner. We've had that experience whenever we're hiking on trails, or whenever, like I said, we've stopped at some of these animal jams, of people saying, oh, and if you go up the road here, you'll see this. And so we ended up doing that, drove down Slough Creek, and got to see some wolves on someone else's scope, which again was very nice that they let us do that, and got to take a look at that. So that was just a bonus section we weren't expecting.
And one last bonus section, we actually saw an osprey nest, which is very cool because apparently they're pretty high and near rivers. So we got to see it with all the little baby osprey, and that was just kind of a fun little surprise.
So after that, we left Lamar Valley and headed over to the Roosevelt Lodge, which is one of the places that you can eat in the area. We ate in their dining room, which had really fun rocking chairs out front while you're waiting for your food to come out and waiting for a table. So we had a great time there. The food was pretty good. You really, really liked your bison burger, I know in particular.
Yeah, the bison burger was phenomenal. I don't know what it is, if it's just like the meat or how it's cooked, but bison meat from our past experiences just seemed to be dry, a little tougher. But the burger was actually really, really good.
Yeah, Roosevelt Lodge.
I would recommend the bison burger there.
So we ate there, and then we headed back out of the park.
After we left the park, we then went to check into our new campground, which was Rainbow Point, about 10-15 minutes down the road from our previous campground.
So about 20 to 30 minutes away from Yellowstone, West Yellowstone as a whole.
And not to be rude or anything, but this campground just wasn't as good as Baker's Hole.
The biggest issue was the bugs. So this particular area is by the Hebgen Lake Reservoir, which sounds really nice because you get to be by this lake, but you actually aren't able to swim in it most of the time because there's the potential for different like toxic materials or something in it. And it has attracted thousands of mosquitoes. So we're like parking our RV and just like swatting, like it was getting bit all over.
I mean, it was summer, it was 80 degrees, and we were in pants and sweatshirts to keep the mosquitoes off.
It was crazy.
It was intense.
We would not recommend it, mostly just because, again, the bugs were pretty bad. It was a beautiful spot, and we liked the area, but the bugs were, there really wasn't that many other bugs anywhere we were, like a normal amount. You're out in the woods, but this was insane. You couldn't really spend any time outside because of it, so was not the move as far as moving to that spot. So we'll be there for the next week.
But after we checked in here, we then went to Mass in town again at the same church, and after this, we went to another brewery for dinner where we just kind of got like salads. I got another burger actually, but I really enjoy burgers.
This was at the Madison Crossing Lounge. So they also had this really great appetizer of bison nachos, which was delicious, and just kind of enjoyed our time there, and we had a really late lunch. So this was a late dinner as well, and wasn't super extensive. Most of us didn't eat a lot other than Cooper, who decided he needed more food.
That's right. And that is everything that we did in this past week at Yellowstone. Next week, we are also in Yellowstone for the full week, so be sure to stay tuned to see what we do next week.